So welcome to Athletic Wise, where like-minded people come to connect. We focus on sports science and how it applies to the sports we love. In today's edition of the High Performance Speaker Series, we will be discussing sports nutrition. Nutrition plays a critical role in sports performance. It is also something many athletes struggle with, in particular, fueling on the fly. Today's guest in the High Performance Speaker Series is Dr. Art Zemach. Art is a director of research and development at Tailwind Nutrition. Tailwind has caught on quickly in the sporting world, and in particular is now heavily relied upon in the ultra running community. Art, thanks very much for agreeing to be interviewed.
Well, thanks for having me.
So events like an ultra induce considerable losses, including those of energy stores, water, and electrolytes. Replacing such significant losses without overloading a stress system poses a challenge for many participants. High intake of carbohydrates appears to be primarily the nutritional cause of GI symptoms and one of the main reasons cited for dropping out of races. Now, is that the impetus for creating Tailwind?
Yeah, pretty much. Tailwind was started by my friend Jeff Veerling. He likes the Leadville 100 mountain bike race and has done it at least 10 times. He had a very hard time finding a fuel that didn't give him GI problems. Some of the things that he struggled with hindsight were very slow burn, complex carbohydrates that would make it all the way to your colon and give you gas, and proteins that he had some sort of intolerance to. I think he has a true IgE mediated soy allergy and doesn't do well with cow's milk either. So in order to get a drink that he could tolerate for 100 miles of mountain biking, he invented Tailwind in his kitchen. And that formula, he's a bright guy, went to Stanford, did all the research and figured out what he needed to do to make something really good, and tested it and refined it. And that his invention, Tailwind Endurance Fuel, has now stood the test of time for, I think, six going on 7 years now, with a lot of success in the ultra running community and other places.
Oh, that's great. So the ability to consume, tolerate, and absorb large amounts of carbohydrates, like, for example, 80 to 90 grams per hour in demanding events is a challenge. Why has Tailwind been so well received and adopted by those, whether it be in something like CrossFit CrossFit Games over the, a few days, or an ultra? How come it's so well tolerated?
I think it's successful because it works. Why it's well tolerated, if you're doing something that really stresses your body for a long period of time, like say a 100-mile ultra run, you've got three issues that you need to manage for your body: your hydration, your fueling, and your electrolytes. And any one of those three issues can be relatively complex. Plus, those three issues depend on each other. Your electrolytes affect your hydration affects your electrolytes, your fuel intake is affected by the sodium, and vice versa. They all play off each other. I think what Tailwind does, and why it's been so successful, is it takes all those three complex issues and solves them in one drink. So you can drink nothing but Tailwind for your 100-mile ultra run, and we have athletes who do that and win or get on the podium. So it's a very simple, clean burning fuel, but it does the right thing for the amount of hydration, the right thing for your electrolytes, principally your sodium, and also the right thing for your fueling.
That's great. So the International Society of Sports Nutrition recommends that ultra endurance athletes aim for between 450 to 750 milliliters per hour of fluid, 30 to 50 grams of carbohydrates per hour, and 150 to 400 kcals per hour of energy intake. Many athletes don't follow that. If you're in agreement with those recommendations, why do you think most athletes don't adhere to that?
I would say that I am in agreement with those recommendations. I guess take them one at a time. The first is the fluid intake. Though that amount of fluid, sort of the 500 to 700 mils per hour, the half a liter to 3/4 of a liter per hour. I think the upper limit is actually 800 mils, but let's call it 750 or 3/4 of a liter. That's actually kind of a ceiling that you're not supposed to surpass. And one of the reasons for that is that um, an issue in ultra running can be hyponatremia, your sodium being too low. And one way to get hyponatremia is to drink a lot of water and not enough sodium. And that is one of the problems that Tailwind solves. You will notice that relative to some of the other sports drinks out there, we have a lot of sodium. I would actually say that we have more like an appropriate or even slightly on the light end amount of sodium. To keep your body hydrated, water has to follow sodium. Without sodium, the water won't stay in your body. So the balance between water and salt, water and sodium, they have to travel as a package deal. And I think Tailwind does a particularly good job at managing that. However, there's a second reason why you might develop hyponatremia. And that is something that that exercise scientists call exercise-induced hyponatremia, and it works by a different mechanism. You as a doc might recognize it as an exercise version of SIADH. Basically, you get an inappropriate amount of a hormone called ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. And it's a response to stress. It makes sense evolutionarily if you think about it, and we could explain that if you like. But basically, if you are over drinking, which some people do on a hot day because they think it will help them with overheating or hypothermia. If you are over drinking, then when your body shifts into this mode, you can get hyponatremia no matter what it is that you are actually drinking. So those recommendations are actually from the International Committee for on Exercise-Induced Hyponatremia, because there have been illnesses and deaths from this, and it's basically from over drinking. So the Cliff Note version is, if you over drink, you can get hyponatremia no matter what's in your bottle. You should drink an appropriate amount, and I totally agree with that amount you mentioned, basically half to 3/4 of a liter per hour. Once you're doing that amount, then you want the right amount of sodium. And once you're getting the right amount of water and the right amount of sodium, then you want the right amount of carbohydrate in a form that's quite available to you. The form that Tailwind uses is a combination of very simple sugars, glucose and sucrose, which during exercise are actually the best way to get your carbohydrate. Now, that's not true if you're resting. If you're resting, your physiology is very different. And then your best carbohydrates are things like broccoli and kale, very slow burn, complex carbohydrates that move your blood sugar very slowly. Broccoli, while great for dinner, turns out not to be a very good racing fuel. And the carbohydrates that work best once you are exercising actually turn out to be the more simple sugars like glucose and sucrose.
Yeah, that was a fantastic recap there. Yeah, it's surprising that the numbers, like hyponatremia isn't very common, under 100K, but over 100K, it's up to 20% of individuals experience that. So astronomical numbers, really. Do you have any guidelines in terms of like racing in the heat, doing an ultra in the heat? Any like recommendations as far as Tailwind intake or modifying?
So those, you'll notice those international recommendations, 500 to 800 mils per hour. That's quite a range. And that rate, so if it's a colder day and you're a lighter lady, then you might be more in the half a liter per hour range. If it's a hotter day and you're a large guy, um, then you want to be more on the higher end of that. But I think it is important. People talk about drinking to thirst, and I'm a big proponent of that. You basically want to drink when you're thirsty, not to satisfy some formula. The people that really get in trouble with hyponatremia and drink too much have some sort of recipe that they think they need to achieve. And it's really fine to drink to your thirst. Um, Everyone wants guidelines, and hence that half to 3/4 liter per hour guideline. But if you're way outside those guidelines, trying to achieve some sort of goal that you've come up with using math, that's probably a bad idea. It's better to be in that range. And then once you're in that range, drink to your thirst.
Yeah, that was great advice. In a really interesting study last year, researchers found evidence for an elementary energy supply limit of 2.5 times basal metabolic rate. Beyond that limit requires drawing on one's own energy stores. How would you propose reconciling that for a race like Big's Backyard?
I guess the simple answer to that, if we're talking about Big's Backyard, would be that last year, Our Lady Maggie Guterl won Big's Backyard, um, beat all the men, and was the last human standing in that race after 60 hours, and I'm even forgetting how many hundreds of miles it was, but it was quite. And she just basically did it all on Tailwind. And so, we're talking in terms of carbohydrate, 200 to 300 calories per hour, and the amount of fluid that we talked about. And then Tailwind is also keeping your sodium right.
Yeah, that was excellent. Quite the show. With all the recent attention on the 2-hour marathon and the rise in popularity of ultras, there appears to be a renewed interest in sports nutrition, specifically optimizing exogenous carbohydrate to substrate use. Research can be difficult to make sense of outside of academia. Studies that don't show any statistical significance may have practical relevance at the elite level, especially. So, I use the example in the 2016 men's marathon, the difference between a gold and silver medal is that small. So do you have any thoughts in that regard?
Um, and let's see. Can you be a little more specific? Are you asking about the amount of fuel or the type of fuel, or?
No, it's like sometimes we rely on research and we look at, comparative studies in sports nutrition. We say, okay, well, specifically looking at carbohydrates, oh, well, there's no significant difference between, loading at 80 or 60 grams per hour versus 120 grams. But actually, when practical significance is, you do a lot better in the race, positioning wise, let's say. So kind of weighing in on the whole, research, what is considered significant. And, from a practical standpoint, I think as runners, we have to kind of weigh a little bit differently on the research data.
Um, I think that's well said. The research data can be helpful, and but you also have to go out there and test it, and it has to actually work. Some of the new ideas, for example, people are trying to get more carbohydrate in at a lower osmolarity, and by using long chains of glucose polymers and whatnot. And I think, well, that sounds good, if you're doing math at your desk. There are problems with those approaches that we can talk about if you like.
Great. How about in terms of protein? Studies examining the use of protein supplementation post-endurance training and racing are equivocal. Do you believe this is largely due to basically the studies are so different? Like it could be the status of the training, the athletes they're using. The studies are so diverse. Do you think that's a reason why?
I think it's a hard thing to study. So, for example, there's pretty good evidence to show that protein soon after exercise helps with glycogen replenishment and carbohydrate soon after exercise helps with muscle rebuilding. And you can show that pretty well um, for exercises like weightlifting, pure strength exercise. It's a lot harder to show that um, for something like a long endurance run. It's my belief that the reason for that is that most of the studies that, if we're talking about muscle protein synthesis, that most of the studies that look at rebuilding muscle are doing muscle biopsies and looking at your actin and myosin fibers, the actual substance of your muscle. So it's easy to find the benefit of both protein and carbohydrate, specifically protein and carbohydrate together right after a workout for weightlifting than it is for a long endurance run, because in a long endurance run, much of your benefit is in the production of new mitochondria. And you're not looking at the mitochondria when you're doing a muscle biopsy, you're only looking at the skeletal muscle. And I think that's why it's harder to see it's harder to measure those benefits for endurance sports than it is for strength sports, partly because people kind of aren't looking in the right place.
So do you believe refueling with a recovery drink to be a superior strategy than trying to consume enough water? Let's say like a food source of protein, food source of carbohydrate. Do you think it's just, soon after finishing your workout, you try and replenish with a liquid protein, liquid carbohydrate?
That is the point of our recovery drink, Tailwind Rebuild. And the way that was designed was um, basically for your body to decide that it's ready to rebuild muscle. There's a controlling enzyme called mTOR that is kind of the gatekeeper for all of that stuff. And it is not going to turn on muscle protein synthesis unless it has everything there that it wants to have. You've got to have all of the essential amino acids, the ones that you can only get from your diet. You have to have glucose, and enough glucose and insulin so that your body doesn't think that it's starved for energy. It's not going to build muscle if it thinks that somewhere else in the body you're starved for energy. You can't be too acidotic. You have to be well hydrated. You can't be under too much stress. Basically, your muscle rebuilding machinery isn't going to start turning on until everything's right and everything's there. So that's what we did with our recovery product is we just asked the question, what is everything that this enzyme needs? And then if you put it together all there in one place, then that just gets your recovery started a lot sooner.
Oh, that's great. So the hydrogels have been recently a buzz in the endurance circles. However, the data doesn't really back it up in terms of there hasn't been any performance benefits. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not a fan, and I'm happy to explain why. Let's say you and your friend go out for a long run, and you're otherwise perfectly evenly matched. You're going to take all of your calories, just to make it simple. Let's say you're going to take all of your calories with pure glucose, and your friend does some math and realizes that the osmolality of your solution is going to be pretty high, and she's worried about that. She shouldn't be worried about that if she understood how your GI system works and handles fluid, but she is, and so she decides to take all that carbohydrate as some sort of super starch or very large maltodextrin molecule. So then you guys go out for your run. One of the problems with that strategy is that there are no transporters in your gut for maltodextrins or long starches. There are transporters for monosaccharides and disaccharides, but not for anything longer. So before her fuel can be used, it has to get chopped up all the way back down into the glucose that you're drinking. A second problem with that is that if it takes too long to chop those molecules down, then they can get all the way through your small intestine and end up in your colon. your colon's where your friendly bacteria are. They're not used to seeing carbohydrates. But if you design a special molecule that can get all the way through your gut, when the bacteria see that, they'll eat it, and as a byproduct make gas, and then you feel bloated and have a lot of GI distress. So this strategy of trying to reduce the osmolality and pack more calories in there has two ways to backfire. One is you have to turn it back into glucose to get used anyway, so it's not as readily available. And plus, sometimes it ends up causing a lot of GI distress.
Very, very interesting. Well,
You know, I would, on the subject of osmolality, I would note that your body, if you're not exercising, you know, puts 8 to 10 liters of fluid into your guts and then takes them back out every day. So the amount of fluid that your own body puts in and out of your GI system dwarfs the amount of fluid that you drink. So there really isn't a good reason to think that you have to match the osmolality of your blood with whatever you're drinking, because your body, from an osmolality standpoint, is perfectly capable of handling whatever you put in there, be it pure water or very thick concentrated food without water. Osmolality usually is not a problem for your GI system. It's designed to handle a super broad range.
wow, that was, yes, very, very informative. That was fantastic. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to this conversation?
I think something that is probably for the future, and that we have not addressed either. You know, our endurance fuel is a pure carbohydrate, and people are super successful with that. Our recovery drink is a very high quality, complete protein that's very easily digested. And we don't market it as an endurance fuel, but people are finding out that it's actually a great endurance fuel. And the science behind that, I think, is what will be new and coming down the pike for us.
Very, very interesting. That was great. Well, thank you so much, Art. I think that was fabulous.
Well, thanks for having me.
That was really very, very informative. So if anyone would like any more information, they can go to tailwind.com or athleticwise.com. Yeah, I'm sure, you know, I will, you know, post this interview. And once again, Art, that was phenomenal. Really appreciate it.
I enjoyed it a lot. Thanks for having me.